Hello brewers of the internet. Today I'll be brewing a British barley wine. This one has a deep sunset orange color, smells of cedarwood and orange, and at 9% alcohol is a force to be reckoned with. It has a delicate maltiness, hints of fresh nuts, orange and honey, and finishes with a notable bitterness and harmonic vinous alcohol note. This is today's recipe. For an original gravity of 19.9 degrees Plato or 1083 a specific gravity, together with a target bitterness of 41 IBU, this beer will have a bitterness to gravity ratio of 0.5, making it a nicely balanced beer without it being too bitter. The grain bill for this beer consists of 100% Maris Otter malt. In terms of my water, I am aiming for more chloride than sulfate, to emphasize the maltiness a little. All of the magnesium is from my tap water, and the calcium is partly from my tap water and the brewing salt used. I also had to add some lactic acid to reach my desired mash pH. The hops I'll be using are Admiral for bittering and East Goldings and Sterling for aroma. Additionally, I'll be adding some Irish moss and Yeast Nutrient to the boil. To ferment the wort, I'll be using WLP 007 dry English ale yeast. And to finish the beer off, I'll carbonate it to about 4 grams a liter of CO2, that's about equal to 2 volumes. But let's get right to it. I start off by weighing out my water additions, 12 grams of calcium chloride and 6 grams of calcium sulfate for my specific water. I will also be adding some 80% lactic acid to counteract the high carbonate hardness of my local water and reach a good mash pH. Next, I fill my mash kettle with enough tap water to reach a water to grist ratio of 3 liters per kilogram. That's about 1.45 quarts per pound for Americans, and heat it to 56 degrees Celsius. Once it reached that temperature, I add all of my Maris Otter malt slowly and gradually to make sure there are no clumps forming. My agitator helps greatly with that. Because the malt was stored at room temperature, the mash temperature sinks to about 52 degrees Celsius, at which point I will hold a protein rest of 15 minutes. This is usually not necessary with modern malts. This crop of Maris Otter, however, has a much higher protein content than usual, and this helps break that down a little. After 15 minutes have passed, I increase the temperature to 63 degrees Celsius and rest for 45 minutes. The final rest will be at 72 degrees for 25 minutes, followed by heating the mash up to about 78 degrees for mash out. This temperature guarantees that I have the lowest possible viscosity of my wort, aiding in lautering, but still keeps some of the alpha amylase enzymes intact, so that any starches released during the lautering will still be broken down into convertible sugars. By step mashing this way and doing a rather long maltose rest at 63 degrees, I want to create as few unfermentable sugars as possible, to make this beer as strong as possible while still allowing it to be crisp and easily drinkable. After the protein rest is done, I take a mash sample to check my mash pH using a handheld pH meter. The mash pH came out at around 5.45, which is pretty good. Once my 72 degree rest is finished, I take another sample to perform an iodine test to make sure that there is no more starch in my wort. I add a few drops of wort onto a watch glass on a white background and add some iodine solution. The orange color indicates that all my starches have been converted, and I can mash out and proceed to lautering. While the mash heats up to 78 degrees for mash out, I recirculate some 78 degree hot sparge water through my lauter tun in order to preheat the vessel, so it does not cool down my mash, and to guarantee that I have the lowest possible viscosity of my wort during the lautering process. Before I transfer my mash over, I drain the hot water from the lauter tun and leave just enough water in there to fill the space below the false bottom, called foundation liquor. I then turn off the heat on the kettle and transfer the mash from the kettle into the lauter tun using a big jug. Once all of the mash has been transferred, I give it a stir with my mash paddle so it sits evenly on the false bottom. I then allow the mash to sit for 15 minutes to settle down. After this lauter rest is done, I attach the outlet of my pump to the recirculation attachment and slowly recirculate the wort. The first thing coming out is the foundation liquor, followed by still very turbid wort. I allow the wort to recirculate for 8 minutes and then attach the pump's outlet to the kettle, which has been rinsed in the meantime. Now I slowly pump the nice and clear wort into the kettle. At the same time, I connect my hot liquor tank to the lauter tun's sparge attachment, and once the grain bed becomes visible, I slowly pump hot liquor over the grain bed, paying extra close attention not to let the grain bed run dry. Towards the end of the sparge, I use a large kitchen knife to cut a crisscross pattern through the grain bed to open it up and wash out a little more extract. I take great care not to cut all the way down to the bottom, as that could lead to channeling. Once I have reached my target kettle full volume, I stop sparging and bring the wort to a boil. It took a total time of 47 minutes to collect all of my wort. While the wort is still heating up to boiling, I add the bittering hops and give them a good stir. Once the wort has reached boiling, I set a timer for 2 hours. The longer boil is necessary to reach the high gravity I'm aiming for. At 15 minutes before the end of boil, I add the yeast can Goldings, and 10 minutes before the end of boil, I add the Sterling hops for aroma, as well as some Irish moss and Yeast Nutrient, stirring in each of the additions thoroughly. During the boil, I connect my counterflow wort chiller to my grain father, which I have been using as a hot liquor tank. I heat up a few liters of water to near boiling and recirculate that through the counterflow chiller as well as my aeration unit and the hose that will go to the fermenter to sanitize them. After the boil is over and my desired wort volume has been reached, I kill the heat and I set up my pump to do a whirlpool. The inlet draws wort from a port at the bottom of the kettle and the outlet pumps it through an angled dip tube back into the kettle. I allow the whirlpool to spin for 10 minutes and leave it to rest and settle down for 10 more minutes after that. While the whirlpool is running, I prepare my fermenter. The fermenter has been cleaned previously and only needs to be sanitized now. To do this, I use a spray bottle of isopropyl alcohol that has been diluted down to 70%. I spray everything thoroughly with the alcohol and make sure every surface is covered and every nook and cranny, such as the area below and inside the dip tube, have been sprayed. I put the lid on the fermenter and after about 15 minutes I drain the sanitizer through the drain valve of the fermenter. I'm now approaching the end of the brew day. I connect the pump so that I can draw wort from the dip tube in my kettle and pump the wort through the counterflow chiller. The stainless steel T-piece contains an air stone connected to an electric aquarium air pump that aerates the wort. As the kettle empties, it first seemed like the whirlpool had failed, but the drop you can see at first is just a lot of coagulated protein that was too much for the size of the kettle to handle in the whirlpool. This is common for strong beers like this one. Below the protein sediment you can see a beautiful cone of hops being revealed. After the transfer is done, I first take a sample to measure my original gravity and then go ahead to pitch the yeast. I'm using White Labs WLP 007 Dry English Ale, which I have prepared a starter for. You can see these really big flakes in the starter, which is normal for the super flocculent yeast. I pour the entire starter, including the stir bar for good luck, directly into the chilled and aerated wort. I add a blow-off tube to the NC post on top of the fermenter and set the temperature to 20 degrees Celsius. To conclude the brew day, I take a reading of both original gravity and wort pH. Note that the sample I'm measuring has been taken before I added the yeast, because the yeast and the starter volume do not contribute to my original gravity. For the gravity reading, I use a U-tube density meter. For this, I first rinse my syringe with some of the wort to avoid contaminating the sample with any residue from the syringe. I then draw about 10 milliliters of wort into the syringe and slowly inject the wort into the device. After a few seconds, the reading shows up on the companion app of the density meter on my phone. The wort came in at an original gravity of 19.9 degrees Plato. That is a specific gravity of about 1083. I then take a pH reading using my handheld pH meter. The wort came in at a decent 5.81. With the brew day over, only cleanup is left, which I will spare you from. Fermentation had started by the next morning and I took a sample each day to check gravity and pH. As you can see, gravity dropped down most of the way in the first 6 days of fermentation, and pH dropped down to a safe pH of about 4.5 after just 3 days, indicating a healthy and vigorous fermentation. After 5 days, I raised the temperature from 20 degrees up to 22 to encourage the yeast to ferment a little higher. Between days 6 and 14, the fermentation had stalled, but then restarted to finish the beer for a final gravity of 3.5 degrees Plato, or 1014 as specific gravity, giving us a degree of apparent attenuation of just over 82% and an alcohol content of a little over 9% by volume. After fermentation was done, I lowered the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius for 2 weeks to allow the beer to mature and for sediment to drop out. All of the beer was then kegged by connecting a sanitized silicone hose to the drain of the fermenter and the liquid post of a sanitized and purged NC keg. I make sure that the keg is completely vented, so there's no pressure that would then push back into the fermenter, disturbing any sediment. Before opening the fermenter's valve, I connect a blow-off tube to the keg's gas post and put it in some water. I then open the fermenter and allow the beer to flow into the keg. To avoid oxygen exposure, I connect a CO2 bottle at a very low pressure of around 2 or 3 psi to the lid of the fermenter. I fill the keg until the beer starts flowing out of the blow-off hose, indicating the keg is full. I stop the flow by disconnecting the liquid and gas couplers from the keg. Any remaining beer was filled into bottles with some sugar added to provide carbonation. To carbonate the beer, I've equipped the keg with a carbonation lid. The lid of this keg has a gas post connected to a piece of tubing with a carb stone at the end, which allows me to quickly and effectively carbonate the beer. To carbonate the beer, I put my CO2 bottle on a kitchen scale and set it to 0. I have also calculated that to bring the beer to a carbonation level of 4 grams per liter, which is equal to about 2 volumes, I will need around 50 grams of CO2 for 1 keg. I connect the CO2 bottle to the carbonation post, apply about 3 bars or 45 psi of pressure, and shake the keg to dissolve the CO2 into the beer. Occasionally I disconnect the CO2 bottle from the keg to get an accurate reading on the scale, which now shows me how much CO2 I've taken out of the bottle. At some point the scale showed that I had used 54 grams of CO2, meaning the beer is now fully carbonated. The only thing left to do was to put the beer in the fridge and let it settle down for a few hours, after which it is ready to be tapped. I later used a counter pressure bottle filler to put some of it into bottles. This concludes the making of this beer. If you want to see more brew days like this one, consider subscribing. Click the bell icon to get a notification whenever I upload a new video. If you learned something new, leave a like, and in case you have any questions, feel free to leave them as a comment and I'll reply to them as soon as I can. Until the next time, I'm the Beer Engineer. Cheers!